I'll never forget the morning I got the letter. I had just poured myself a coffee, ready to enjoy the quiet of my lake house when I saw the official-looking envelope in the mailbox. My name was on it, but the return address was from the HOA. My first thought, who even sends letters anymore? My second thought, oh no, this can't be good. I ripped it open and immediately froze. It was one of those letters that starts politely but ends with threats and fines. Apparently the HOA, yes, the same HOA I didn't even belong to, was telling me I couldn't live in my own lake house. My hands were shaking, partly from coffee, partly from disbelief. You have to understand, I had bought this property precisely because it was peaceful, private, and completely outside the reach of meddling HOA rules. I didn't want a neighborhood that dictated what color I could paint my mailbox or whether my lawn gnome was compliant. But here it was, a document signed by Karen, the self-appointed queen of HOA tyranny, claiming that my land was somehow under her control. I stared at it for a long time. I reread the paragraph about immediate compliance and penalties for violations. The threats were so over the top, I almost laughed out loud. They said I had to remove my dock, repaint my house in HOA-approved colors, and pay a fine, and join the HOA immediately or vacate the property. Vacate my own property. After the initial shock, I started packing the house, trying to figure out if this was a prank. Could Karen really be this bold? I mean, she already had a reputation among the neighbors for nitpicking grass heights, mailbox placement, and even the direction their pumpkins faced at Halloween. But this was next level. It was like she had read a villain handbook and thought, I'll just take over someone's land today. I decided I needed to act fast. I grabbed the letter, my keys, and my dog, who looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and headed to the local county office to check my property records. On the way, I imagined Karen sitting in her HOA throne, clipboard in hand, ready to declare war over a piece of land that wasn't even hers. At the county office, I pulled up the property maps. My heart was pounding as I traced the boundaries, and then I saw it crystal clear. My property line didn't touch the HOA's territory at all, not even a corner. I almost wanted to cheer, but instead I felt a mix of relief and anger. Karen had gone too far. Driving back to the lake, I started thinking about my next move. Should I confront her directly? Should I ignore the letter and hope it went away? My gut said no. Karen thrived on fear, on control. Ignoring her would only make her bolder. If I wanted to keep my lake house and my sanity, I had to fight back. But how do you fight someone who has convinced an entire neighborhood that they're the authority? Back at the lake house, I paced again, glancing at the dock where my kayak was tied. That dock had been my escape for years, my little piece of freedom. And now apparently it was up for review by the self-proclaimed HOA sheriff. I looked around, imagining her walking down my driveway with that clipboard, ready to issue fines for every imaginary violation. I knew I needed evidence, something undeniable. Property surveys, maps, county records, anything that would prove this land was mine and mine alone. But part of me also wondered, how far would she go? Karen wasn't the type to back down easily, and she had the support of neighbors who loved gossip more than facts. As the sun set over the lake, casting gold and pink reflections on the water, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to defend my land, I was going to expose the absurdity of this HOA takeover. And I was going to make sure Karen, the clipboard queen, realized she couldn't bully people into obedience. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. Karen had no idea I was about to turn her little power play into the most satisfying lesson of her HOA career. And trust me, the cops were going to be involved sooner than she expected. The next morning, I woke up determined to figure out exactly how Karen had convinced herself she had authority over my land. I brewed a strong cup of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and pulled out every document I had on the property, the deed, old surveys, and even the property tax statements. I needed proof, solid, undeniable proof that my lake house was mine and mine alone. First, I double-checked the county property maps online. My hands shook a little as I zoomed in and traced my property line. Yep, completely outside the HOA boundaries. I could almost hear Karen's furious squeak echoing across the lake, but everyone knows this is our neighborhood. Spoiler alert, knowing something doesn't make it true. Next, I called the HOA office. Oh, this was a mistake, but one I had to make. After being on hold for what felt like an eternity, long enough for me to question all of life's decisions, I finally got Karen on the phone. She sounded smug, like she already had victory written into her clipboard. You need to comply with the HOA rules, she said, her voice dripping with authority. You have 30 days to remove your dock and repaint your house, or we'll escalate the fines. I tried to remain calm. Karen, my property is outside the HOA boundaries. I've confirmed this with the county records. There was a pause, a long one, and then, well, that's complicated. Maybe you just don't understand the neighborhood guidelines. Ah, yes, neighborhood guidelines. a polite way of saying, I'm going to bully you anyway because I can. I realized I was dealing with someone who thrived on being right even when she was clearly wrong. After hanging up, I decided it was time for a little reconnaissance. I drove around the perimeter of my property, making mental notes of where the HOA territory actually started. I waved at a few neighbors who looked concerned but mostly amused. One of them whispered, "She's been trying to pull this with your place for months." Apparently, Karen had been sending people to report violations at my house without ever actually checking if she had the authority. That's when I came up with a plan. I needed proof that even the authorities couldn't ignore. I contacted the county surveyor's office and requested the official property maps. I also dug out an old surveyor's notebook from the previous owner, which showed my property lines in precise detail. As I pieced together the evidence, I couldn't help but laugh at how ridiculous this had become. Karen, armed with her clipboard and fancy letters, actually thought she could control land she didn't own. I imagined her marching down my driveway, measuring my dock with a tape measure while I sipped iced tea, smiling at her futile efforts. But humor aside, I knew this was serious. Karen had escalated to threats, fines, and even eviction notices. She was counting on fear, confusion, and bureaucracy to win, and if I didn't act carefully, I could find myself in a messy legal nightmare. I spent the next few days organizing everything: copies of deeds, survey maps, tax documents, and photos of the property. I even included GPS coordinates of the property lines for extra accuracy. Every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence was a potential bulletproof argument. Finally, I realized something crucial. Karen wasn't just a bully, she was a showman. She thrived on creating drama, on making neighbors feel she was untouchable. If I wanted to beat her, I couldn't just rely on facts. I had to make sure the right people saw them, authorities who could actually stop her. I leaned back in my chair, taking a deep breath. I could already imagine the showdown, me armed with undeniable proof, facing Karen, who would have to swallow her pride and face reality. And I knew one thing for sure: when the cops saw the evidence, Karen would lose and she wouldn't see it coming. Little did she know, her self-proclaimed reign over my lake house was about to crash spectacularly, and this was just the beginning. I knew it was only a matter of time before I had to face Karen in person. Talking on the phone and gathering maps was one thing, but nothing would stop her from marching down my driveway with that clipboard and a smug expression unless I confronted her head-on. The problem? Karen thrived on confrontation. She had perfected the art of making anyone who disagreed with her feel like they were breaking some sacred law of the neighborhood. The day I finally saw her, I felt a mixture of nerves and determination. I opened the door to my lake house and saw her standing at the end of my driveway, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the sunlight like some kind of HOA general inspecting her troops. "I'm here to ensure compliance," she said, smiling in that way that made me want to roll my eyes so hard they almost got stuck. I decided to remain calm. "Karen, I've looked into all your claims. My property is outside the HOA boundaries. I have official maps and records that prove it." She frowned, pretending to consider my words but clearly dismissing them in her mind. "Well, maybe you just don't understand the rules. Everyone in this area has to follow the HOA guidelines." "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "the rules don't apply to me. Look." I held up a map I had printed, showing the property lines and the HOA boundaries. Her eyes narrowed, but instead of admitting defeat, she tried to intimidate me. "Even if that's true, it's my duty to oversee the neighborhood. You should join voluntarily. It's better for everyone." I laughed, the sound echoing across the lake. "Better for everyone? You mean better for you? You've been sending neighbors to report me, threatening fines, and trying to control property that isn't yours. That's not better for everyone. That's harassment." Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. I could see the gears turning in her mind. She wanted me to slip up, to say something she could use as leverage. She wanted me to panic, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. We argued back and forth for a while, her using vague threats, me citing facts and evidence. I pointed to the property maps, GPS coordinates, and even photos of the lake boundaries. She tried to wave them off, but each time she did, I could see a flicker of doubt in her eyes. At one point, she stomped her foot like a child and muttered, "You think this ends here? You're making enemies." I smirked. "I think it ends the moment someone checks the official records." Despite my confidence, I knew this confrontation was just the beginning. Karen wouldn't back down easily, and I couldn't rely on neighbors to have my back. Some of them loved gossiping too much to care about facts, and a few of them were so loyal to Karen that they would report every little thing I did just to stay on her good side. After about 30 minutes, Karen finally walked back to her car, muttering under her breath. I watched her go, knowing she was furious but powerless for now. I couldn't help but feel a small victory, but the real test was coming. The next step was to gather evidence that couldn't be argued with, something that would hold up even if Karen tried to spin her lies. I spent the rest of the evening going over the property deeds, previous surveys, and even old tax records. Each piece of paper was like ammunition. I realized that Karen had underestimated me. She had assumed that intimidation and neighbor gossip were enough to control me, but I had something she didn't: facts, documentation, and the patience to see this through. As night fell and the lake reflected the colors of the sunset, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. The first confrontation was over, but the war was far from finished. Karen would try to escalate, and I had to be ready. The suspense of what she might do next hung over me like the mist on the lake in the early morning. Little did Karen know I was already planning the next move, the one that would involve more than just maps and deeds. The police were about to enter the story, and when they did, everything would change. After my first face-to-face confrontation with Karen, I realized that talking wasn't enough. She wouldn't just admit she was wrong, and her letters and threats would keep coming. I needed evidence so solid that even she couldn't argue with it, evidence that could make authorities intervene if she tried to escalate further. I started by organizing every piece of documentation I could find: my property deed, old surveys from previous owners, tax records, and even handwritten notes from the county surveyor. Each page I stacked on my desk felt like armor against the absurdity of Karen's claims. I could almost hear her voice from the first confrontation: everyone in this area must comply. She was about to find out that everyone didn't include me. Next, I walked the perimeter of my property with my phone, taking pictures and videos. I documented the dock, the boundaries marked with trees and fences, and the distances to the HOA's land. Humor kept me sane during this process. Imagining Karen storming across the lake with a measuring tape, trying to enforce rules on my own dock, made me chuckle out loud. My dog, sitting beside me, tilted his head as if to say, "Are we really doing this?" I also reached out to the county office and requested official property maps. This wasn't just for my personal assurance. I wanted certified proof that my land was legally mine. When I got the maps a few days later, I spread them across the dining table like a detective in a crime show. Every line, every coordinate, every boundary marker screamed the same thing: this is mine. Karen has no jurisdiction here. But I didn't stop there. I remembered a conversation with a neighbor who had dealt with Karen before. She gave me a tip: Karen loved reports from neighbors. People who sided with her often exaggerated or even made up violations just to please her. Knowing this, I decided to document everything meticulously in case Karen tried to fabricate a story about me. Over the next few days, I compiled GPS coordinates of my property lines. I even drove along the border, recording distances to HOA land and taking timestamps to show when I was on my own property. It felt like preparing for a small-scale battle, but I knew that if Karen tried anything, I'd have irrefutable evidence. During this process, Karen sent another letter. Her tone was as condescending as ever, warning me about immediate fines and possible legal action. I read it and laughed. This was the same woman who thought her clipboard gave her the power to evict me. I stuffed the letter into a folder labeled evidence and thought, "You're about to find out what happens when someone underestimates me." I also contacted the local sheriff's office, not to complain yet, but to get advice on how property boundaries are officially. The deputy I spoke with chuckled when I explained the situation, saying, "You're going to have to show them the maps. Some people take this HOA thing way too seriously." That laugh gave me hope. If the cops could see the absurdity, Karen wouldn't stand a chance. Meanwhile, I started noticing Karen's desperation. Neighbors whispered that she had been knocking on doors, trying to rally support. Apparently, she thought if she could create enough noise, she could pressure me into compliance. Little did she know I was building a case so airtight that her threats would be meaningless. By the end of the week, I had a full dossier: maps, deeds, surveys, GPS coordinates, photos, and video footage. Each piece confirmed the same thing: my land was mine, and the HOA's rules did not apply. I even made copies for the sheriff, ready to bring them into the next confrontation if necessary. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight, I felt a mix of anticipation and determination. Karen thought she could scare me with letters and threats. She thought she could bully a homeowner into submission. But I had something she didn't: facts, evidence, and the patience to wait for the right moment. Little did she know, the next time she tried to enforce her rules, the police would be there, the maps would be laid out, and her reign of intimidation would be over. The suspense of that moment, the showdown between a self-appointed HOA queen and a homeowner who refused to back down, hung in the air like the fog over the lake. And I was ready. I should have known that Karen wouldn't just accept defeat. She was far too dramatic for that. A few days after I compiled my evidence, another letter arrived in the mailbox. I stared at it for a full minute before opening it. The language was so over the top I almost laughed out loud. Fines, penalties, deadlines, and worst of all, threats to escalate the situation if I didn't comply. Apparently, she thought that piling on more letters would make me give up my lake house. I grabbed a pen and a notebook and began making a list of everything Karen was trying to enforce. Repaint the house, remove the dock, join the HOA, and my personal favorite, submit a weekly lawn report. A weekly lawn report. I could already imagine her walking around the neighborhood with her clipboard, measuring grass blades like a miniature tyrant. I decided to pay her a visit, not to argue but to assert that I wasn't intimidated. When I drove down the driveway, she was waiting like a sentry, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the bright morning sun. "I see you've received my notice," she said, her tone full of authority. "You have 30 days to comply." I held up my folder of maps, deeds, and property surveys. "Karen, I've reviewed all the records. My property is outside HOA jurisdiction. Your rules don't apply here." Her face turned red, and I swear I could hear her frustration sizzling in the air. She tried to interrupt me, waving her hand dramatically as if that would magically make my evidence disappear. "Well, technically, there are neighborhood guidelines you should follow." I chuckled. "Neighborhood guidelines? That's adorable and also irrelevant. I'm not subject to your rules. I've got the paperwork to prove it." Karen's jaw tightened, and she muttered something under her breath before storming off, only to return with a new tactic. She had apparently convinced a few neighbors to report violations at my house, claiming I was building structures without approval. It was petty, ridiculous, and hilarious all at once. I couldn't believe she thought that would intimidate me. Over the next few days, I noticed Karen's desperation growing. She started showing up at odd hours, packing near the edge of her HOA territory, clipboard in hand, hoping I'd do something she could use against me. I even caught her measuring distances to my dock with a tape measure like a character from a slapstick comedy. I wanted to shout, "Do you really think this works?" Despite her theatrics, I stayed focused. Every attempt she made to bully me was recorded. Photos, videos, timestamps, all neatly organized in my folder. Humor helped me survive the stress. I would tell myself, someday someone will make a sitcom about this and Karen will be the villain with the clipboard obsession. But it wasn't just about laughing at her antics. I knew Karen's escalating behavior meant the showdown was coming. She would either continue her harassment or push it far enough that authorities would be involved. And I was ready. I had spent weeks gathering irrefutable proof that my property was mine and mine alone. The suspense was building. Every knock on the door, every note slipped under the mailbox made my heart race. Karen was escalating, testing boundaries, and counting on fear to win. But she didn't realize she was walking straight into the evidence I had meticulously prepared. Finally, after one particularly tense morning, I realized she was about to make a big mistake. She had decided that letters and neighbor gossip weren't enough. She was planning to take the next step, one that would involve someone with the authority to enforce rules: the police. And that was exactly the moment I had been waiting for. All my maps, deeds, surveys, and GPS coordinates were ready. Karen might have thought she was the queen of the neighborhood, but she had no idea the cavalry was about to arrive, and it wasn't her HOA allies. As I watched her walk away, muttering about next steps and legal action, I smiled. The suspense was mounting, the stakes were higher than ever, and the next confrontation would be the one where everything changed. Karen had no clue just how quickly her reign of clipboard terror was about to crumble. And I couldn't wait to watch it happen. By this point, Karen's antics had reached a whole new level. Letters, neighbor reports, and clipboard inspections weren't enough for her anymore. She was clearly gearing up for a bigger move, and I knew I needed professional backup, so I called the local sheriff's office. Explaining the situation over the phone was surreal. "So let me get this straight," the deputy said, barely hiding his amusement. "The HOA is trying to enforce rules on land you don't even belong to." "Yes," I replied, holding back a laugh, "and she's been sending neighbors to report violations. I've got the deeds, surveys, and GPS coordinates." There was a long pause on the other end, then a chuckle. "I've heard of overzealous HOAs before, but this is something else. Bring everything in and we'll take a look." A few days later, I had my evidence ready: maps, deeds, photos, videos, and even GPS coordinates of my property lines. I arrived at the sheriff's office, my heart pounding with anticipation. I laid everything out on the desk, showing the deputies every inch of my lake property. Karen, of course, had no idea I had involved the authorities. She probably thought she could continue her intimidation tactics and scare me into submission. Meanwhile, I felt a mix of satisfaction and suspense. The next step was about to unfold, and I could almost hear her mental breakdown in slow motion. When the sheriff reviewed the documents, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. Yep, this land is yours, completely outside HOA boundaries. There's nothing here that gives them jurisdiction over you. I felt a rush of relief and triumph. Finally, someone official had confirmed what I already knew, but Karen wasn't going to just vanish quietly. She needed one last attempt to assert control. The next day, she showed up at my driveway looking more flustered than I'd ever seen her. Her sunglasses were crooked, clipboard clutched like a shield. I don't know why you're involving the authorities, she said, trying to maintain her facade. I calmly held up a copy of the sheriff's confirmation. Karen, the authorities have confirmed my property is outside the HOA. Your rules do not apply here. Her face went red, then white, then red again. She opened her mouth to argue, but the deputy who had reviewed my case happened to drive by just for a routine patrol and noticed her standing there. He stepped out and said, "Ma'am, you've been informed. The homeowner is correct. You have no authority here." Karen froze, mid-sentence, her clipboard trembling in her hands. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her mind, trying to process that all her years of self-imposed authority had crumbled in front of the law. Neighbors had gathered quietly, curious about the commotion. I caught snippets of whispers. Is she really that crazy? And I can't believe she tried this. It was almost satisfying to see the doubt and shock in their eyes. Karen tried one last desperate plea, but what about neighborhood guidelines? The deputy raised an eyebrow. Guidelines, they have no legal weight here. Your authority stops at the HOA boundaries, that's it. It was over. Karen's reign of terror had ended. For the first time, I felt a deep sense of relief. I could finally enjoy my lake house without fear of fines, letters, or neighbor gossip instigated by her. As I walked back to my dock, watching the sun reflect on the water, I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Karen had escalated from letters to intimidation, but in the end, facts and the law had won. And the suspense of waiting for her to realize she had no power, that had been the sweetest part. That night, I sat on my porch, listening to the gentle lapping of the water. The entire ordeal had been exhausting, stressful, and sometimes ridiculous, but I knew I had defended not just my property but my peace of mind. Karen might have tried to bully me, but the truth and the law had my back. Little did she know, the next chapter of this saga would be her ultimate humiliation, and I was ready to see it unfold. Just when I thought things couldn't get more ridiculous, Karen decided to escalate one last time. She must have convinced herself that the sheriff's office was somehow mistaken, or maybe she thought she could pull a legal loophole out of thin air. Either way, she was about to make the biggest mistake of her HOA career. That morning, I saw her approaching my driveway again, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose like a self-appointed judge at a court of public opinion. She had a small stack of papers, which I assumed were her legal threats, and she was muttering to herself about zoning laws and neighborhood guidelines. I couldn't help but smirk. The sheer determination on her face was almost impressive if it weren't so delusional. "Good morning, Karen," I said casually, leaning against the doorframe of my house. "I see you've brought more paperwork, planning to measure my dock again." She glared. "This isn't over. There are zoning regulations you need to follow. I've researched them." I cut her off, holding up my folder of evidence. "Karen, the sheriff has already reviewed all this. Every property line, every deed, every map, my land is outside HOA boundaries. Your rules don't apply, period." Her face flushed and she waved her hands dramatically. You're trying to manipulate the system." I chuckled. "No, I'm just following the law. Funny how that works, isn't it?" Karen's desperation escalated. She actually pulled out a ruler and started pecking along the edge of my dock, measuring distances as if this tiny act would somehow magically prove her authority. I had to bite back a laugh. A grown woman, ruler in hand, trying to enforce imaginary rules on my private property. It was like a bad sitcom playing out in real life. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The sheriff arrived for a routine check-in just in time to witness Karen's antics. He raised an eyebrow, glanced at the ruler, then shook his head. "Ma'am, this is completely unnecessary. You have no authority beyond the HOA property line. You've been informed multiple times. Stop wasting your time." Karen froze, her ruler hovering midair like a cartoon villain caught red-handed. The neighbors, who had gathered quietly, started whispering and exchanging glances. I could see the doubt creeping into Karen's eyes, the realization that she had lost control completely. She tried one last desperate tactic, threatening to take me to court over some obscure zoning regulation she had pulled from a random website. I calmly smiled and said, "Karen, if you truly want to pursue this, the courts will see the maps, deeds, and the sheriff's confirmation. I welcome it. But in the meantime, my lake house is mine and your threats are meaningless." Her lips quivered, the smirk that had carried her for years vanished, replaced by stunned silence. She turned on her heel and stomped back to her car, muttering about next time and this isn't over. But everyone could see it, her reign of intimidation had ended and she had no power left. I let out a deep breath and walked down to my dock, the water calm and reflective beneath the sun. The suspense of facing Karen had been intense for weeks, but now it was over. She had escalated, tried to bully, measured, argued, and threatened, and yet the law and common sense had won. Humor helped me process the absurdity. I imagined her back at the HOA meeting, reporting her defeat as if anyone would believe she had been heroic. Meanwhile, I could finally enjoy my property without fear of letters, fines, or overzealous neighbors whispering her propaganda. That evening, as I sat by the water, I reflected on the entire ordeal. It wasn't just about a dock or a house. It was about standing your ground, knowing your rights, and refusing to be intimidated by someone else's false authority. The suspense, the anticipation, and yes, the absurdity of Karen's actions made the victory even. The final twist, Karen had one more chance to realize the truth, and I was about to witness it firsthand. The next part wouldn't just be a victory for me, it would be a total collapse of her HOA fantasy, and I was ready to enjoy every second. The morning after the showdown, I woke up with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. The lake was serene, reflecting the sunrise in perfect gold and pink streaks, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. Karen's last desperate attempt had failed, and I knew the law was firmly on my side. But as I sipped my coffee and watched the water ripple, I realized the story wasn't quite finished. Karen had one more choice. She could either accept reality or continue trying to assert control. Given her track record, I suspected she'd choose the latter. And sure enough, later that morning, she appeared again, looking flustered and frantic, clipboard clutched to her chest like it was a life preserver. "Look," she started, her voice shaking, I've reviewed everything and I think maybe we can negotiate." I raised a hand, smiling calmly. "Karen, the sheriff's office has confirmed my property lines. The courts would see the same thing. There is nothing to negotiate. This land is mine. Your HOA rules do not apply." Her eyes widened in disbelief. She opened her mouth, paused, and then closed it again. It was like watching a cartoon character deflate. Every neighbor who had gathered along the street could see the moment she realized she had no power left. She tried to speak again, but all that came out was a stammered, "But the rules, the neighborhood." The deputy who had accompanied me a few days before happened to drive by, saw the scene, and pulled over. He stepped out, gave Karen a polite but firm nod, and said, "Ma'am, your authority ends at the HOA property line. You've been informed. This matter is resolved." Karen's face went pale. For the first time, she had no words, no threat, no clever loophole. The clipboard she had wielded like a scepter suddenly seemed comically small in her hands. She turned, muttered something about "this isn't over," and stormed off. Everyone watching exchanged amused looks, whispering about her meltdown. I couldn't help but laugh. Weeks of absurd letters, threats, neighbor reports, and ruler measuring had all led to this. Karen had finally been stopped, not by yelling, not by arguing, but by patience, evidence, and the law. Walking down to my dock, I felt a sense of triumph that went beyond the paperwork and the confrontation. This was my lake house, my sanctuary, my freedom. Karen's attempts to control me had only made me stronger, more determined, and even more appreciative of this property that I had fought so hard to protect. I spent the afternoon enjoying the water, kayaking past the boundaries she had once tried to enforce, laughing to myself at the absurdity of it all. I thought about how far she had gone: letters, threats, neighbor gossip, and even public confrontations. Yet in the end, all of her effort had amounted to nothing. My evidence had been bulletproof, the authorities had confirmed the facts, and the neighbors could see the truth for themselves. By evening, I sat on my porch, the lake calm and quiet. Karen's HOA tyranny had collapsed completely. The suspense and tension of the past weeks faded into a satisfying sense of victory. I could finally relax, knowing I had defended not only my property but my peace of mind. And humorously, I imagined Karen back at the HOA meeting, packing the room with her clipboard, trying to explain her defeat to her loyal followers. They would no doubt look at her in stunned silence, realizing she had lost credibility entirely. It was the perfect poetic justice. Her obsession with control had led to her ultimate humiliation. I leaned back, took a deep breath, and watched the sunset reflect on the water. The lake house was mine, Karen's reign of absurdity was over, and life had returned to the peaceful rhythm I had bought it for. This ordeal had taught me one thing: knowledge, patience, and preparation always trump intimidation. And sometimes the funniest, most satisfying victories come when someone who thought they were untouchable realizes the rules they tried to enforce don't even apply to them. The lake rippled gently beneath my kayak, and I smiled. Karen had lost, I had won, and my little paradise remained exactly that, mine. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.